All right. Everybody got their weave strapped on? Got your toothpaste strapped on, men? Got your dentures glued in? This is the Halloween episode of the Dixie Cryptid podcast. My name is Cameron Buckner, and I'm so glad you joined me. I've got 4 stories. It's kind of a long upload. And if you'll watch the screen as the stories come up or read the description, you will find out where these stories came from. Well, I just hope you enjoy it. It's family friendly. Let's get rolling. All right, here we go. Sundowners by Jack Lafountain. The temperature in the car was rapidly climbing, but Brienne still hadn't worked up the courage to open the door of her battered Pinto and set out into the cool breeze blowing in off the Pacific. She simply sat staring across the street at the rambling old mansion. 5 minutes before her appointment, she reached for the key that would start the engine and let her drive away. Instead, her shaking hand fell into her lap. "It's an interview. What's the big deal?" she asked the empty passenger seat. Her eyes turned to the mansion. Brienne's momentary bravado withered. The heavy oak gates set into the arch and the low courtyard wall were open and welcome. Through them she could see the dark green yuccas wearing clusters of white bell-shaped flowers that ringed the court where the fountain bubbled a soothing invitation to step back into old California. "I can do this. I have to do this," she thought. Brienne took a deep breath and stepped out onto Pasco del Mar. The breeze that ruffled her auburn hair was scented with brine borne up from the surf crashing far below. Another day in paradise. She had grown up in San Pedro and spent summers tanning at Cabrillo Beach, but she didn't remember the old adobe mansion on the cliffs. That wasn't surprising. The last 2 years with Kyle had taken more than just her dignity. A pair of passing surfers eyed Brienne with undisguised appreciation, and she tugged at the hem of her skirt, sure that her slip was showing. Once across the street, Brienne lingered by the fountain. She told herself she was taking time to smell the gardenias that grew along the house, but the nagging chill running down her back said otherwise. Her unease flittered on butterfly wings just beyond reach of her control. Brienne flipped a penny into the fountain for luck, stepped over the fears lying between her and a new start, and she walked to the door. There was no bell near the weathered oak doors. Brienne knocked and waited. Relief washed over her when a second knock went unanswered. "No one home. You can go," she told herself. She was turning to leave when movement caught her eye. One of the doors swung open to reveal a pallid scarecrow in a black suit and starched white shirt staring down at her. He lifted a thin hand to shield his eyes. The man's downturned mouth made Brienne wonder if she smelled bad. "I'm Brienne Christopher." Her words failed to crack the man's stony effect. "Mr. Zana is expecting me." The scarecrow nodded. An upward turn chipped away at the edges of his lips. A sweep of his hand bid her to enter. The large foyer's candles and crosses reminded Brienne of a small church. Crosses carved in the heavy doors convinced her it was true, until a spark of recognition brought memory to life. "No, this isn't a church. It's a funeral home. I remember it now." Brienne swallowed hard and hurried after the scarecrow. The clack of her heels drew a disapproving backward glance from the man. Cursing the clamor, she followed her guide down a dark hall to an unmarked door. The man opened it without knocking and motioned her inside. Edison Zana was a neat, trim man in what she guessed was his mid-50s. A trace of gray colored his temples. Zana's otherwise dark hair and charcoal Armani accentuated his smooth olive skin. "Welcome to Sunset Assisted Living." Zana's baritone was as rich as his eyes. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. Please sit down. I must say your name is very impressive. I hope sunset doesn't seem too tame for you." The administrator smiled. Brienne ignored the crawling sensation that smile sent down the back of her neck. Did he see her shiver or smell the anxiety she felt rolling off of her? She wasn't sure. "Actually, I'm looking for a change of pace," she said, hoping to sound more confident than she was while avoiding sounding too eager. Zana held out a hand to a nearby chair. His smile suddenly disappeared. "I'm going to be frank with you. I won't waste your time or mine. Sunset is not for everybody." He held up a manicured hand. "No, please let me finish. We get a lot of resumes, and we pay extremely well, and the money attracts a lot of interest. But we're looking for a commitment to the unique needs of our residents. Money can't buy that. So tell me, Miss Christopher, why are you here?" Brienne shrank into her chair. The old insecurity, carrying the flotsam of the last 2 years, was back in full force. She had told the social worker at the shelter that her days of being beaten were over. But were they? It was knuckle time, as Kyle was so fond of saying. Brienne wiped her palms. That wasn't the way to interview, but at the moment she didn't care. No more covering up the bruises. "I'll be equally honest," she began. "I need a fresh start. I'm going through a divorce and living at the women's shelter. I need money, but I need more too. I need a chance to care again. I need people." Zana's eyes softened. "Our residents can be challenging. After 5 years in the emergency room, I'm ready for new challenges." On firmer ground, Brienne straightened in her chair. "You've heard of Sundowners syndrome?" he asked. "I've heard of it." Red flags went up poles along Brienne's neutral pathways. Here it comes. Here's the catch, she thought. "All the residents here are afflicted with a particular form of that malady," Zana told her. "As such, they require some special attention." Perfect. I'm not chasing crazies. I don't care what it pays, she thought. "Do they wander at night?" she asked. "No." Zana fumbled his pen. "No, we have measures in place to prevent that. They get a little confused now and then, to be sure, but it's perfectly safe. They refuse to sleep at night, so things are a little busier then. We accept that here. At their age, I feel they should be allowed to do as they please. Within reason, of course." Of course. More red flags were hoisted in her mind. "It's not like that," Zana said, as if he could read her concerns. "Sunset is a privately funded facility. Our residents are expected to abide by the rules. However, they still need their independence and our compassion. Surely you understand that. The direct care is handled by our night attendant. Anna's been with us forever. She's a wonderful woman, but human compassion is not her forte. I'll be counting on you to supply that. When can I start?" Brienne left Sunset fingering a new name badge and battling the intense craving for pizza. "Extra garlic, please." A huge smile lit her face. She had a new job, the potential for a new life, and when the pinto started on the first try, there was cause for celebration. Brienne made a left onto Gaffey and headed to Bono's Pizzeria, determined to spend the last of her cash on her sudden craving. At 3 p.m, the restaurant was almost empty. Brienne no longer went out at regular mealtimes or during daily commutes. There were things worse than eating alone, much worse. Knuckle time. She had made up her mind not to be one of those cowering in the shelter. Nevertheless, she was cautious. She wasn't going to be Kyle's prisoner the rest of her life. "I'll die first," she thought. That was the one point upon which she and Kyle were in agreement. The pizza came, and Brienne pushed the thought aside. She was celebrating. The world always looked brighter through layers of mozzarella, provolone, tomatoes, and garlic. It was comfort food. She felt better already. An hour later, Brienne dropped the box containing the remnants of her pizza on the passenger seat and slipped behind the wheel of the Pinto. Instant terror pumped ice through her veins when she glanced into the rearview mirror. Brienne gasped for breath. A black pickup with a leering skull in the back window rolled slowly by. Knuckle time. The Pinto's engine ground and refused to fire. Red lights flared in the corner of the mirrors. There were brake lights. Oh my God. Brienne twisted the key again. The engine coughed to life. She threw the car in gear and stomped the accelerator and bounced between the cars parked at the curb and into the street. Sanity returned somewhere north of Pacific Coast Highway. Brienne made a series of turns to make sure she wasn't followed and retreated into the shelter. Behind locked doors, she buried her face in a pillow and sobbed away the lingering fear. The close call scared the hell out of Brienne. It also steeled her. The next evening, she bundled her fear into the driver's seat and went to work as planned. Sue, the day nurse who had taken her on a tour the day before, was waiting. "You're early," Sue said. "I like you better all the time." "I have a thing about being late." Brienne put her purse on the desk. "Did you bring a book?" "Oh, no matter. There's a library down the hall. You're sure to find something there," Sue said as she gathered her things. "What about the patients?" Brienne asked. "We call them residents, honey," Sue reminded her. "Anna will take care of them. Sit back, read a book, and enjoy life." "Anything else?" Brienne asked. Sue's face turned to stone. "Always wear your name tag." At 9:30, laughter drew Brienne from the office. The long hall to the residential wing was alive with silver-haired people. There was not a cane or walker to be seen. The impeccably dressed group descended on the new nurse with a bounce in their step, their heads erect, and their shoulders straight. Max had been in German filmmaking until the Nazis came to power, and on his arm was a regal beauty with a Slavic accent named Elizabeth. New Englanders Mercy and Simon came west after losing children to illness. Michelle was drawn to Hollywood in the 40s. Richard lived many years in Sacramento. The group was eager to hear about Brienne. Their interest melted her heart. She was swept along into an inner room where silver moonlight hung from the high glass ceiling onto an eclectic collection of furnishings. The group gravitated toward favorite seats, the last of each one's cherished personal possessions. "I love the starlight," Mercy swept a hand skyward. She then joined Simon and Michelle rifling through a stack of old records. Glenn Miller filled the room with a big band bounce, and Brienne joined the others at the table near the windows. "Do you play cards?" Richard asked. "Not very well, perhaps one of the others." Brienne nodded toward the group by the phonograph. "They don't play," Richard groused. "They're prisoners of the puritanical upbringing." Richard fanned the cards and vanished the deck with a turn of his hand. The cards appeared in his other hand, and he began to shuffle. His hands deftly worked the deck. His eyes never left Brienne. "I've been warned about you," she said with a wink. "They're lies, they're all lies," Richard assured her. The impish mischief in his eyes made her smile. "You can be Richard's partner," Elizabeth offered. Elizabeth offered the chair opposite him. "Max and I are wise to his tricks." "Roughs and honors?" Max asked. Richard began to deal. Somewhere amid the turning of cards, big band boogie, and tales of days long past, the sky turned a deep violet that gave way to indigo. Anna began lowering shades over the windows and closing the retractable cover overhead. "I'm done," Richard said. He stifled a yawn. "Think I'll go to bed." "Will you come again tomorrow night?" Elizabeth asked. "Of course I will." Brienne laid a hand on Elizabeth's shoulder. Her skin felt cold even through her dress. Brienne jumped. "Are you all right, dear?" A cloud passed over Elizabeth's face. "I'm fine," Brienne said. "It's been a long night." "Come along, madame," Anna said. "It's time for bed." As Anna steered her down the hall, Elizabeth glanced back and waved. At the end of the hall, the residents parted company, women to the left and men to the right. Brienne heard doors close. Silence descended on the Sunset Retirement Home. "I see you survived the night. How was it?" Sue asked. "Great. They're lovely." Brienne was beaming. "I may like being a nurse again." "Yeah, well, be careful," Sue warned. "Those lovely old souls have fangs." Brienne couldn't help but laugh. It was possible to become cynical no matter where you worked, she thought as she walked out. The sun sat atop Point Furman Lighthouse. The Pacific, dressed in shimmering gold, gently rocked a tanker awaiting the pilot boat. Below her, the surf beat against the rocks and sending explosions of foam high in the air. She drank in the tangy smell of the ocean until the morning chill sent shivers along her arms. Brienne whistled big band tunes and tapped the steering wheel in time on her way home. In a week, she'd be free of the shelter. She was jazzed. But the silent invitation of her bed was overpowering. Brienne kicked out of her clothes seconds before her eyelids came tumbling down. That evening, Brienne again found herself whistling big band tunes and dreaming of the new convertible in her future. Her mind didn't register the black Ford that pulled out into traffic behind her. She bounced inside Sunset, eager to spend another night with her residents. Well, it was silly to think of them that way so soon, but her heart had a mind all its own. The residents appeared as they had the night before. Brienne joined them beneath the stars where Anna had set a table with champagne and finger food. Brienne settled for tea and sampled the delicacy called a black sausage. Laden with food and drink, the card players gathered at their table. The others were off to their music. 2 hands into the game, Anna appeared, phone in hand. "A call for you, Mr. Christopher." She looked like she had sipped rancid milk. "Well, who would be calling me?" Before the caller spoke a word, Brienne knew. The color drained from her face, and her lip quivered and her eyes grew wide. She clamped a hand over her mouth. A whimper seeped through her fingers. "That's a nice place," Kyle slurred. "I'll see you in the morning." And the line went dead. Brienne wished for the same fate. She staggered to the waiting champagne. She needed a drink. It was knuckle time. Her trembling hands sloshed champagne on her blouse. Tears of frustration and despair coursed down Brienne's cheeks. Mercy took the glass from her and tried to steady her. "Let me help." Elizabeth tipped Brienne's face up to hers. Brienne tried to look away. Something moved in Elizabeth's eyes. It was impossible, but there it was again. Brienne leaned closer. A single white feather, like the ones from Grandma's pillows, floated onto the soft breeze. Brienne felt the wind on her face and in her hair. She was floating, too. "Enough, Elizabeth," Max ordered. Elizabeth released her. Brienne looked into the worried faces surrounding her. She was back in the ER again. She was bloody and battered. She fled to the staff restroom before the tears came back. Brienne was certain that time the tears would never stop. But of course they did. Life goes on. Brienne looked in the mirror. Despite the snot running from her nose and her red, puffy eyes, for the first time in years, she didn't see the ugly creature Kyle said lived in her skin. Behind the mucus and the tears was a woman of worth, delicate as a flower or perhaps a feather. Brienne blew her nose and wiped her eyes and splashed cold water on her face. Some of the redness and swelling was gone. Anna knocked and offered a worn but dry scrub top. Brienne washed out her blouse and hung it to dry. She would go face the questions. She'd done it before. Simon sniffed the air. The scent was intoxicating. Richard's mouth began to water and spit round down his chin. Mercy threw back her head, sucking down deep draughts of the scent. Elizabeth licked her lips and chomped the air, and Max clawed his way through the group, biting and scratching. desperate to be first. The residents of Sunset Home closed on Brienne like starving wolves, lips drawn back and fangs bared and eyes burning with bloodlust. Faced with sure death, Brienne, the agnostic, crossed herself. A hand seized her, and she was jerked off her feet and thrown to the floor. "No!" Anna screamed. She stepped between Brienne and the advancing terror, an uplifted crucifix in one tiny hand. "For God's sake, get in there and get your name badge on," Anna commanded. Brienne scrambled into the restroom. Her name badge hung beside her blouse. Brienne pulled the lanyard over her head and collapsed near the sink. "Oh God, oh God, oh God." The thought played like a mantra through her brain. A knock on the door brought the walls closing in. Brienne screamed. There was no place to hide. "Mr. Christopher," Anna called. "Everything's all right. I'm coming in." A small squeak escaped Brienne's throat. The door opened. Anna was alone. She sat next to Brienne on the floor and put an arm around the nurse's shoulder. Brienne's breathing resumed a normal pace. Anna's voice was soft and warm, and Zaina was wrong about her. Brienne was silent, soaking in Anna's words. Once the existence of vampires is accepted, it's easy to believe that intemperance is the first step on the undead's road to dementia. Vampires in a refurbished funeral home even made sense. "The view here is lovely," Anna said ironically, "but we really should get back to work." In the parlor, the monsters were gone. In their place sat 6 contrite senior citizens, heads hung like guilty children. "We're sorry," Max confessed, and there were tears in his eyes. "Don't leave us, Brienne," Elizabeth pleaded. "Please," Mercy chimed in. "It won't happen again, I promise." Tears flowed. The unreality Brienne felt took on a familiar timbre. Her inhuman charges were more human than diabolical. An uneasy acceptance, born more of resignation than peace, settled over Brienne. There was indeed nothing new under the sun. "Who was that on the phone, dear?" Mercy asked. "It's the man I'm divorcing." It was Brienne's turn to hang her head. "Is he mean to you, dear?" Brienne nodded, unable to speak. "There is a way to be free." Simon pushed the phone toward Brienne. The group was smiling at her. There was a twinkle in Simon's eye. Why not invite him over to work things out? It took a moment. A smile crept into Brienne's lips and slowly blossomed across her face. Bullyproof. Author unknown. Cassie Swenson struggled with her weight. She had come to terms with it, and her group of friends were supportive. But moving to a new town and starting at a new school filled her with a dread she hadn't felt for a long time. She recognized and remembered the fear of meeting an entirely new group of students. She stood looking up at the school building, dreading walking inside. She forced a smile and began to walk up the steps. "You can do this," she said to herself as she reached for the handle of the door and hesitated. When she was inside, she went to the principal's office to get her class assignments and then walked slowly toward the room indicated on the list where her history class was located. She looked through the small pane of glass and saw the class was deep in discussion already. With a deep sigh, she opened the door, and the entire class turned and looked at her. She walked up to the teacher and handed him the paper. Mr. Wilkins looked at the paper and then at her and smiled slightly. "Okay, class, we have a new student. This is Cassandra Swenson," he said, almost too happily. She leaned in and whispered in his ear that she preferred Cassie. He smiled back and stood back up. "This is Cassie Swenson. Please welcome her and make her feel at home." "Hello, Cassie," the entire class replied with less enthusiasm. Very good," Mr. Wilkins said blandly. "Okay, Cassie, please take a seat and feel free to join in any time." She walked down the aisle to the only seat available toward the middle of the classroom as everyone watched her. She felt instantly like she was on display and she hated it. "Okay, we were discussing the possible theories regarding the disappearance of the Jamestown settlement. Who has any new ideas that haven't been addressed?" Mr. Wilkins asked brightly. Debbie looked at Cassie and raised her hand. "Maybe they got eaten," she said coldly. Everyone in the class laughed when they realized what she meant. Cassie turned away from her and shrank further in her chair. Later in the cafeteria, she waited in line when Stacy Beecham waved her over as she stood with Debbie closer to the front. "Here," she said slyly, "you look like you need more food than we do. Just try to save some for the rest of us." Everyone in line laughed as Cassie turned and walked away feeling totally humiliated. After the day was over, Cassie went straight home and ran up to her room. What a horrible day, she thought, as she collapsed in her chair and looked at the blank screen on her phone. She quickly logged in and looked up ways to deal with bullies at school. As she looked at the various websites, one stood out from the others. She hadn't seen a web address like this before, and the difference intrigued her. She hesitated only for a moment and clicked on the link. Her screen blinked and crackled for a moment. A warning came up on her screen from her virus protection. "You are about to enter the dark web. Please be careful with the information you share." She thought for a moment and was about to click the button to close the website when her phone vibrated. She picked it up, looked at the message. There was a new posting on the school's website. "Since the school is looking for a new mascot," it began, "we have a proposal." There was a link to a picture underneath, and she instinctively clicked on it. The picture was familiar. She recognized the features immediately. The shoulder-length brown hair and the glasses. The face was hers, but the body had been photoshopped into a pig's body. "We will name the new mascot Swineson," the caption under the picture read. Her heart sank and her eyes welled up. She knew a new school would be hard, but she never expected this after only the first day. She tossed her phone down and held her face in her hands, trying to fight back the tears. As she removed her hands from her eyes, she glanced back at the computer screen. The warning was still flashing on the screen, but behind it she saw the words, "Tired of being bullied? We can help." Without caring about the virus threat any longer, she closed her security warning and clicked enter on the website. "Welcome to Bully Proof" appeared on her screen in bold red letters. She entered her information to sign up as a member. As usual, she skipped over the fine print agreement. "Those things are all the same," she scoffed as she clicked next. The new screen came up asking her to choose her level of protection. A circle with a red line through it labeled Standard asked if she wanted to simply monitor any references to her name. Under that was a lightning bolt with the words next to it, "Delete any references to your name as soon as they are identified." That's better, she thought to herself, but I don't know. She continued to read, and at the very bottom was a skull with the words next to it, "Delete posters." She thought. Deleting the poster from my social media is probably the best way to deal with it. She clicked on the skull. Her phone vibrated instantly. She picked it up. The new app icon was right there in the middle of her main screen. "Bully Proof. You have selected maximum protection. Click to activate." She clicked on the icon. A scanning bar appeared. It began to fill up very slowly as the app scanned the internet for what it was looking for. It moved very slowly, and underneath were the words, "This may take a while." Rolling her eyes at the phony app running, she laid the device on her bedstand, pulled the covers over her, and she fell asleep. While she slept, the clock next to her bed read 1:18 a.m., and her phone buzzed. The app has finished its scan, preparing to initiate safety measures. The screen was flashing. Instantly, the signal from her phone contacted the satellites in orbit and bounced all over the town, reaching out to any devices that had a connection to any posting about Cassie. It found only 2 and accessed their information. She woke in the morning and had almost forgotten that her phone was still searching when she grabbed it to check for any messages. The app indicated it had 1 match identified. She clicked on it and the picture of the pig came up and her heart sank again. Under the picture was the name, posted by Deborah Stratton. She thought for a moment, that was one of the girls in my history class. The name glared out at her and made her angry seeing it. Click Apply to delete poster, the app read under the name. Without even thinking, she clicked on the button and the skull's eyes lit up bright red. Poster scheduled for deletion. It reached out across the electronic connections all over town and linked with Debbie's phone. Debbie stood in front of the principal's desk waiting for him to say something as he read the report Mrs. Applewhite had filled out. "Well, Mrs. Stratton," he said with a sigh, "since you like having fun in the cafeteria, you can help Mrs. Applewhite restock the freezer after school today," Principal Lewis said, stamping the paper on the desk in front of him and smiling. It is Friday," Debbie snapped defensively. "Very good, Mrs. Stratton. Now that you know the days of the week, we'll have you up to months of the year in no time." Mr. Lewis said it sarcastically. He handed her the paper. "Oh," she sighed, "my dad's going to hear about this." Quickly she turned and stomped out of the office, slamming the door behind her. Mr. Lewis shook his head as he watched her leave. In the cafeteria, Debbie was watching Mrs. Applewhite stack the boxes on the shelf in the freezer. Suddenly the door closed, causing Debbie to jump slightly. "Oh, don't worry about that. It's programmed to do that so the cold doesn't get out. But don't worry, it won't lock." Mrs. Applewhite smiled. "This is a new state-of-the-art freezing unit, best in the district," she said. "Oh, I'm sure it's the greatest if you have nothing else going on in your life," Debbie sighed, rolling her eyes. Mrs. Applewhite's smile disappeared. "I know you're young and you think you're very hot, Mrs. Stratton, but that's no reason to be so cold to people," she said as she pushed the door open to get more food. Debbie followed her out. "Can we please skip the ethics lesson and get this done so I can get out of here?" "I have a better idea," Mrs. Applewhite said with a smile returning to her face. "Why don't you finish this? I'm going to go start my weekend. I don't have to waste time on this kind of thing with a person like you. Finish this and then you can go." Mrs. Applewhite left. 20 minutes later, Debbie looked at her watch. "Oh, 6:30, she sighed. She grabbed more of the boxes and walked into the freezer and was stacking them on the shelf when she heard the door close again, making her jump. The boxes in her arms dropped to the cold floor. "Stupid machine," she said angrily as she picked up the boxes and placed them on the shelf. Her cell phone sprang to life on the corner outside and connected with the freezer unit. The lock was easy to access and was reprogrammed so it activated. Inside the freezer, Debbie finished stacking the boxes and rubbed her arms to get some warmth back. It felt colder for some reason. She pushed on the door handle and expected it to open as it had before, but it didn't budge. She pushed again, this time harder, but still nothing. Outside the freezer, the digital temperature reading was accessed by her phone and began to lower. It was now 0 degrees and was rapidly falling. Within minutes, it was at -10 degrees, and then -20, and then -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the freezer, Debbie was pounding on the door, but there was no one left in the cafeteria to hear. She was screaming as the temperature got colder and colder. She grabbed anything she could find to try to break the glass, but it was too thick. She saw ice crystals forming all along the window, and they began to obscure her view outside. By the time the temperature reached -60, her hair and skin began to layer with frost. The temperature was still falling. She sat down, miserably cold now. She felt tired, and soon she fell asleep. The temperature in the freezer was now -90 degrees Fahrenheit. Saturday morning, Mrs. Applewhite walked in and found the rest of the boxes stacked on the counter. She shook her head and cursed as she saw Debbie's cell phone on the counter. "Stupid girl," she said, grabbing the boxes. She pulled open the freezer door, which had previously returned to its original setting, and she walked in. She screamed at the sight of Debbie's frozen corpse on the floor. Cassie came down for breakfast. It was 10:30. She'd slept late since it was Saturday. Plus, she had had a hard week. Her mother immediately hugged her tightly. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry," she said with her voice trembling. Cassie looked confused for a moment when she noticed the news on the laptop. A picture of her school surrounded by ambulances and police cars filled the screen. "What happened?" she asked, pulling away from her mother and getting closer to hear what was being said. Police still aren't sure how the girl became trapped in the freezer, but it is being called a tragic accident, the reporter said. The unit was installed a few months ago and appears to be working fine at this point, but it will be shut down until more extensive tests can be done. A candlelight vigil is being scheduled for this evening at the school. Once again, repeating, 16-year-old Deborah Stratton was found this morning frozen to death in the school cafeteria freezer. "Oh my God!" Cassie shrieked and backed away from the screen. "Mom, I knew her. She's in my history class," and she caught herself when she remembered the app on her phone. She raced upstairs and grabbed her phone and opened the app. "User deleted" came up on the screen. She tossed the phone down and covered her mouth to hold in a scream. "Oh my God, that's impossible," she thought frantically. "It must be just a coincidence." Most of the school turned out for the vigil that evening. Cassie walked through the crowd, who largely ignored her with everything that had happened. She noticed Stacy at the front of the line with tears running down her face. "Stacy, I'm so sorry," Cassie said as she reached out her arms to hug her for support. Get away," Stacy said bitterly as she recoiled. "How can someone like you get to live and a beautiful person like Debbie die so horribly?" Cassie couldn't help but feel totally rejected. Inside her pocket, her phone sprang to life as the microphone picked up every word Stacy said. Cassie turned and walked away slowly with her head hung. Maybe she was hurt and just lashing out, but maybe she's always a mean person, she thought to herself as she pulled out her phone to text her mother and tell her that she was on her way home. Before she sent the text, she noticed the one in the corner of the Bulletproof app and clicked on it. The screen lit up with the display and played the recording of Stacy's voice. "One post discovered," the app read. "Press apply for deletion." She looked at it long and hard and listened to the recording again. The words stung more than before. But what if this app did have something to do with Debbie's death, she thought. She closed the app and shoved the phone back in her pocket and continued walking. The phone chimed again, and the number 1 appeared back on the app. She opened it. "You are tired of being treated so badly. You do not have to stand for it. Press apply for deletion," read the icon on the screen. Cassie thought about it and said, "No, no one deserves to die just because of what they say," she said aloud to the phone. "It will not stop. She will continue. Press apply for deletion." The app responded and played the recording again. Hearing the recording again caused Cassie's blood to begin to boil. "It would be nice to not have to deal with it anymore," she said softly. "Press apply for deletion," the app displayed. She clicked on the skull and the eyes glowed red again as the app reached out and contacted Stacy's phone. Cassie smiled slightly and shoved the phone back in her pocket. She continued her walk home. Stacy left the vigil and climbed in her car and began driving home. As she approached the railroad crossing, she stopped as the lights flashed indicating that a train was coming. She sighed and waited impatiently, cussing the train. Her phone sprang to life and connected with her car's onboard computer. It quickly bypassed the braking system and the car began to slowly roll forward. In a fit of panic, Stacy reached for the door handle just as the locks went down and sealed her inside. The car continued to roll onto the tracks as she struggled to get out. She looked out the passenger window and noticed the train lights approaching from around the bend as she struggled to break the glass to get out. The engineer tried to apply the brakes as quickly as he could, but with the momentum of a freight train, he had no time to stop. The train slammed into Stacy's car at 50 miles per hour, dragging it along the tracks before the car burst into flames. Cassie woke in the morning and came down for breakfast again, only to notice her mother white as a sheet. "I just can't believe it," she said as she looked up at Cassie. "Another girl from your school died last night after that candlelight vigil." Cassie could hear the reporter speaking from her mother's laptop. "Once again, another girl, 17-year-old Stacy Beecham, was killed last night when her car apparently stalled on the train tracks at Madison Street. This just after 16-year-old Deborah Stratton's body was discovered at the town's high school, frozen to death in a freezer. Both are being called tragic accidents." Cassie looked at her mother. "Oh, it's so horrible," she said. Cassie turned to go back upstairs. An evil grin formed across her face. She patted the phone in her pocket. The Phantom Coach by Amelia Edwards. The circumstances I am about to relate to you are true. They happened to me, and my recollection of them is as vivid as if they had taken place only yesterday. 20 years, however, have gone by since that night, and during those 20 years I've told the story to but one other person. I tell it now with a reluctance which I find it difficult to overcome. All I ask is that you abstain from forcing your own conclusions upon me. I want nothing explained away. I desire no arguments. My mind on this subject is quite made up, and having the testimony of my own senses to rely upon, I prefer to abide by it. It was only 20 years ago, and within a day or two of the end of the grouse season. I had been out all day with my gun and had had no sport to speak of. The wind was due east, the month December, the place a bleak wide moor in the north of England. And I had lost my way. It was not a pleasant place in which to lose one's way, with the first feathery flakes of a coming snowstorm just fluttering down upon the heather and the evening closing in all around. I shaded my eyes with my hand and stared anxiously into the gathering darkness where the purple moorland melted into a range of low hills, some 10 or 12 miles distant. Not the faintest smoke wreath, not the tiniest cultivated patch or fence or sheep track met my eyes in any direction. There was nothing for it but to walk on and take my chance of finding what shelter I could. So I shouldered my gun again and pushed wearily forward. I had been on foot since an hour after daybreak and had eaten nothing since breakfast. Meanwhile, the snow began to come down with ominous steadiness, and the wind fell. After this, the cold became more intense, and the night came rapidly up. As for me, my prospects darkened with the darkening sky, and my heart grew heavy as I thought how my young wife was already watching for me through the window of our little cottage, and thought of all the suffering in store for her throughout this weary night. We had been married 4 months, and having spent our autumn in the Highlands, were now lodging in a remote little village situated just on the verge of the great English moorlands. We were very much in love, and of course very happy. This morning, when we parted, she had implored me to return before dusk, and I had promised her that I would. What would I not give to have kept my word? Even now, weary as I was, I felt that with supper and an hour's rest and a guide, I might still get back to her before midnight, if only a guide and shelter could be found. And all this time the snow fell and the night thickened. I stopped and shouted every now and then, but my shout seemed only to make the silence deeper. Then a vague sense of uneasiness came upon me, and I began to remember stories of travelers who had walked on in the falling snow until, wearied out, they were fain to lie down and sleep their lives away. Would it be possible, I asked myself, to keep going through the long, dark night? Would there not come a time when my limbs must fail and my resolution give way? When I, too, must sleep the sleep of death? Death. I shuddered. How hard to die just now, when life lay all so bright before me. How hard for my darling. I could not think about that any longer, so to banish it, I shouted again, louder and longer, and then listened eagerly. Was my shout answered, or did I only hear a far-off cry? I hallooed again, and again the echo followed. And then a wavering speck of light came suddenly out of the dark, shifting and disappearing, growing momentarily nearer and brighter. Running toward it at full speed, I found myself, to my great joy, face to face with an old man and a lantern. Thank God, was the exclamation that burst involuntarily from my lips. Blinking and frowning, he lifted his lantern and peered into my face. "What for?" he growled sulkily. "Well, for you. I began to fear that I should be lost in the snow." Folks do get cast away hereabouts from time to time. And what's to hinder you from being cast away likewise, if it be the Lord's will? If the Lord is so minded that you and I shall be lost together, friend, we must submit, I replied. But I don't mean to be lost without you. How far am I from Dwalding? A good 20 miles, more or less. And the nearest village? The nearest village is White, and it's 20 miles to the other side. Where do you live, then? Out yonder, he said with a vague jerk of the lantern. You're going home, I presume? Maybe I am. Then I'm going with you. The old man shook his head and rubbed his nose reflectively with the handle of the lantern. It ain't no use, he growled. He won't let you in, not him. We'll see about that, I replied briskly. Who is he? He is the master. Who is the master? That's not for you to know, was his reply. Look, you lead the way, and I'll engage that the master shall give me shelter and supper tonight. You can try him, muttered my reluctant guide, and still shaking his head, he hobbled gnome-like away through the falling snow. A large mass loomed up presently out of the darkness, and a huge dog rushed out, barking furiously. Is this the house? I asked. Aye, it's the house. Down, boy, down. And he fumbled in his pocket for the key. I drew up close behind him, prepared to lose no chance of entrance, and saw in the little circle of light shed by the lantern that the door was heavily studded with iron nails, like the door of a prison. In another minute, he had turned the key, and I had pushed past him into the house. Once inside, I looked around with curiosity and found myself in a great rafted hall, which served, apparently, a variety of uses. One end was piled to the roof with corn, like a barn. The other was stored with flour sacks, agricultural implements, casks, and all kinds of miscellaneous lumber, while from the beams overhead hung rows of hams, flitches, and bunches of dried herbs for winter use. In the center of the floor stood some huge object gauntly dressed in dingy wrapping cloth and reaching halfway to the rafters. Lifting a corner of this cloth, I saw, to my surprise, a telescope of very considerable size, and it was mounted on a movable platform on small wheels. The tube was made of painted wood, bound round with bands of metal crudely fashioned. The speculum, so far as I could estimate its size in the dim light, measured at least 15 inches in diameter. While I was yet examining the instrument and asking myself whether it was not the work of some self-taught optician, a bell rang sharply. "That's for you," said the guide with a malicious grin. "There is his room." He pointed to a low black door at the opposite side of the hall. I crossed over and rapped somewhat loudly, and I went in without waiting for an invitation. A huge, white-haired old man rose from the table, covered with books and papers. He confronted me sternly. "Who are you?" he said. "How did you get here, and what do you want?" "James Murray, barrister at law, on foot across the moor. Meat, drink, and sleep is all I ask." He bent his bushy brows into a pretentious frown. "Mine is not a house of entertainment," he said haughtily. "Jacob, how dare you admit this stranger?" "I didn't admit him," grumbled the old man. "He followed me over the muir and shouldered his way in before me. I'm no match for 6'2". "And pray, sir, by what right have you forced an entrance into my house?" "The same by which I should have clung to your boat if I were drowning, the right of self-preservation." "Self-preservation? There's an inch of snow on the ground already," I replied, "and it would be deep enough to cover my body before daybreak." He strode to the window and pulled aside a heavy black curtain and looked out. "It is true," he said. "You can stay if you choose till morning. Jacob, serve the supper." With this he waved me to a seat, resumed his own, and became once again absorbed in the studies from which I had disturbed him. I placed my gun in the corner, drew a chair to the hearth, and examined my quarters at leisure. Smaller and less incongruous in its arrangements than the hall, this room contained, nevertheless, much to awaken my curiosity. The floor was carpetless. The whitewashed walls were, in parts, scrawled over with strange diagrams, and in others covered with shelves crowded with philosophical instruments, the uses of many of which were unknown to me. On one side of the fireplace stood a bookcase filled with dingy folios, and on the other a small organ, fantastically decorated with painted carvings of medieval saints and devils. Through the half-open door of the cupboard at the further end of the room, I saw a long array of geological specimens, surgical preparations, crucibles, retorts, and jars of chemicals, while on the mantel shelf beside me, amid a number of small objects, stood a model of the solar system, a small galvanic battery, and a microscope. Every chair had its burden. Every corner was heaped high with books. The very floor was littered over with maps, casts, papers, tracings, and learned lumber of all conceivable kinds. I stared about me with an amazement increased by every fresh object upon which my eyes chanced to rest. So strange a room I had never seen, Yet it seemed stranger still to find such a room in a lone farmhouse amid those wild and solitary moors. Over and over again, I looked from my host to his surroundings, and from his surroundings back to my host, asking myself who and what he could be. His head was singularly fine, but it was more the head of a poet than of a philosopher. Broad in the temples, prominent over the eyes, and clothed with rough profusion of perfectly white hair, it had all the ideality and much of the ruggedness that characterizes the head of Louis von Beethoven. There were the same deep lines about the mouth and the same stern furrows in the brow. There was the same concentration of expression, and while I was yet observing him, the door opened and Jacob brought in the supper. His master then closed his book, rose, and with more courtesy of manner than he had yet shown, invited me to the table. A dish of ham and eggs, a loaf of brown bread, and a bottle of admirable sherry were placed before me. "I have but the homeliest farmhouse fare to offer you, sir," said my entertainer. "Your appetite, I trust, will make up for the deficiencies." I had already fallen upon the food before me, and now ate with the enthusiasm of a starving sportsman. I had never eaten anything so delicious. He bowed down stiffly and sat down to his own supper, which consisted primitively of a jug of milk and a basin of porridge. We ate in silence, and when he was finished, Jacob removed the tray. I then drew my chair back to the fireside. My host, somewhat to my surprise, did the same, and turning abruptly towards me, he said, "Sir, I have lived here in strict retirement for 23 years. During that time, I have not seen many strange faces, and I have not read a single newspaper. You are the first stranger who has crossed my threshold for more than 4 years. Will you favor me with a few words of information respecting that outer world from which I have parted company so long?" "Of course, ask anything," I replied. "I am heartily at your service, sir." He bent his head in acknowledgment, leaned forward with his elbows resting on his knees and his chin supported by the palms of his hands, stared fixedly into the fire, and proceeded to question me. His inquiries related chiefly to the scientific matters, with the later progress of which, as applied to the practical purposes of life, he was almost wholly unacquainted. "No student of science myself," I replied, as well as my slight information permitted, but the task was far from easy, and I was much relieved when, passing from interrogation to discussion, he began pouring forth his own conclusions upon the facts which I had been attempting to place before him. He talked, and I listened spellbound. He talked till I believe he almost forgot my presence, and only thought out loud. I had never heard anything like it then, and I have never heard anything like it since. Familiar with all systems of philosophies, subtle in analysis and bold in generalization, he poured forth his thoughts in an uninterrupted stream, and, still leaning forward in the same moody attitude with his eyes fixed upon the fire, wandered from topic to topic, from speculation to speculation, like an inspired dreamer. From practical science to mental philosophy, from electricity in the wire to electricity in the nerve, from Watts to Mesmer, from Mesmer to Reichenbach, from Reichenbach to Swedenborg, Spinoza, Condillac, Descartes, Berkeley, Aristotle, Plato, and the Magi and mystics of the East, were transitions which, however bewildering in their variety and scope, seemed easy and harmonious upon his lips as sequences in music. I forget now by what link of conjecture or illustration he passed on to that field which lies beyond the boundary line of even conjectural philosophy and reaches no man knows whither. He spoke of the soul and its aspirations, of the spirit and its powers, of second sight, of prophecy of those phenomena which, under the names of ghosts, specters, and supernatural appearances, have been denied by the skeptics and attested by the credulous of all ages. The world, he said, grows hourly more and more skeptical of all that lies beyond its own narrow radius, and our men of science foster the fatal tendency. They condemn as fable all that resists experiment. They reject as false all that cannot be brought to the test of the laboratory or the dissecting room. Against what superstition have they waged so long and obstinate a war as against the belief in apparitions? And yet what superstition has maintained its hold upon the minds of men so long and so firmly? Show me any fact in physics and history and archaeology which is supported by testimony so wide and so various, attested by all races of men, in all ages and in all climates, by the soberest sages of antiquity, by the rudest savage of today, by the Christian, the pagan, the pantheist, and the materialist. This phenomenon is treated as a nursery tale by the philosophers of our century. Circumstantial evidence weighs with them as a feather in the balance. The comparison of causes with effects, however valuable in physical science, is put aside as worthless and unreliable. The evidence of competent witnesses, however conclusive in a court of justice, counts for nothing. He who pauses before he pronounces is condemned as a trifler. He who believes is a dreamer or a fool. He spoke with bitterness, and having said thus, relapsed for some minutes into silence. Presently he raised his head from his hands, and added, with an altered voice and manner, I, sir, paused, investigated, believed, and was not ashamed to state my convictions to the world. I, too, was branded as a visionary, held up to ridicule by my contemporaries, and hooted from that field of science in which I had labored with honor during all the best years of my life. These things happened just 20 years ago. Since then, I have lived as you see me living now, and the world has forgotten me as I have forgotten the world. Now you have my history. It is a very sad one, I said, scarcely knowing what to answer. It is a very common one, he replied. I have only suffered for the truth, as many a better and wiser man has suffered before me. He rose as if he wanted to end the conversation, and went over to the window. It has ceased snowing, he observed, as he dropped the curtain and came back to the fireside. Ceased? I exclaimed, starting eagerly to my feet. Oh, if it were only possible! But no, it is hopeless. Even if I could find my way across the moor, I could not walk 20 miles tonight. Walk 20 miles tonight, repeated my host. What are you thinking of? I'm thinking of my wife, I replied impatiently, of my young wife who doesn't know I have lost my way, and who is at this moment breaking her heart with suspense and terror. Where is she? He said. At Dwalding, 20 miles away, I replied. At Dwalding, he echoed thoughtfully. Yes, the distance, it is true, is 20 miles. But are you so very anxious to save the next 6 or 8 hours? So very, very anxious, I said, that I would give 10 guineas at this moment for a guide and a horse. Your wish can be gratified at a less costly rate, he said, smiling. The night mail from the north, which changes horses at Dwalding, passes within 5 miles of this spot, and will be due at the certain crossroad in about an hour. If Jacob were to go with you across the moor and put you into the old coach road, you could find your way, I suppose. Easily, gladly, I said. He smiled again, rang the bell, gave the old servant his directions, and taking a bottle of whiskey and a wine-glass from the cupboard in which he kept his chemicals, he said, The snow lies deep, and it will be difficult walking tonight on the moor. A drink before you start? I would have declined the spirit, but he pressed it on me, and I drank it. It went down my throat like a liquid flame and almost took my breath away. "It is strong," he said, "but it will help you keep out the cold. And now you have no moments to spare. You must be on your way. Good night, sir." I thanked him for his hospitality and would have shaken hands, but he turned away before I could finish my sentence. In another minute, I had traversed the hall. Jacob had locked the outer door behind me, and we were out in the wide white moor. Although the wind had fallen and it was still bitterly cold, not a star glimmered in the blackness overhead. There was not a sound save the rapid crunching of the snow beneath our feet. Jacob, not too well pleased with his mission, shambled on in sullen silence, his lantern in his hand and his shadow at his feet. I followed with my gun over my shoulder, as little inclined for conversation as Jacob. My thoughts were full of my late host. His voice still rang in my ears. His eloquence yet held my imagination captive. I remember to this day with surprise how my overexcited brain retained whole sentences and parts of sentences, troops of brilliant images, and fragments of splendid reasoning, in the very words in which he had uttered them. Musing thus over what I had heard and striving to recall lost link here and there, I strode on at the heels of my guide, absorbed and unobservant. At the end, as it seemed to me, of only a few minutes, he came to a sudden halt, and he said, "There is your road. Keep the stone fence to your right, and you will find your way." "This, then, is the old coach road?" I asked. "Aye, 'tis the old coach road." "And how far do I go before I reach the crossroads?" "Nigh upon 3 mile," he said. I pulled out my purse, and he became more communicative. "The road's a fair road enough for foot passengers. Mind where the parapet's broken away. Look for the broken signpost. It's never been mended since the accident." "Accident? What accident?" I asked. The night mail pitched right over into the valley below, a good 50 feet or more, just at the worst bit of the road in the whole country." "Oh, that's horrible. Were many lives lost?" I asked. "All lives. 4 were found dead, and the 2 others died the next morning." "How long is it since this happened?" I asked. "Just 9 years," he answered. "Near the signpost, you say? I will bear that in mind. Good night, sir." "Good night, sir, and thank you." Jacob pocketed his half-crown, made a faint pretense of touching his hat, and trudged back by the way he had come. I watched the light of his lantern until it disappeared, and then turned to pursue my way alone. This was no longer the journey of difficulty I had imagined. Despite the dead darkness overhead, the line of stone fence showed distinctly enough against the pale gleam of the snow. How silent it seemed now, with only my footsteps to listen to. How silent and how solitary. A strange, disagreeable sense of loneliness stole over me. I walked faster. I hummed a fragment of a tune. I cast up enormous sums in my head and accumulated them at compound interest. I did my best, in short, to forget the startling speculations to which I had but just been listening, and to some extent I succeeded. Meanwhile, the night air seemed to become colder and colder, and though I walked fast, I found it impossible to keep myself warm. My feet were like ice. I lost sensation in my hands and grasped my gun mechanically. I even breathed with difficulty, as though, instead of traversing a quiet north country highway, I were scaling the uppermost heights of some gigantic Alp. This last symptom became presently so distressing that I was forced to stop for a few minutes and lean against the stone fence. And as I did so, I chanced to look back up the road, and there, to my infinite relief, I saw a distant point of light, like a gleam of an approaching lantern. At first, I concluded that Jacob had retraced his steps and followed me, but even as the conjecture presented itself, a second light flashed into sight, a light evidently parallel with the first and approaching at the same rate of motion. It needed no second thought to show me that these must be the carriage lamps of some private vehicle, though it seemed strange that any private vehicle should take a road disused and dangerous. There could be no doubt, however, that the lamps grew larger and brighter every moment. I even fancied I could already see the dark outline of the carriage between them. It was coming up very fast and quite noisily, the snow being nearly a foot deep under the wheels. And now the body of the vehicle became distinctly visible behind the lamps. It looked strangely lofty. A sudden suspicion flashed upon me. Was it possible that I had passed the crossroads in the dark without observing the signpost? And could this be the very coach which I had come to meet? No need to ask myself that question a second time. It came around the bend of the road, guard and driver, one outside passenger, and 4 steaming grays, all wrapped in a soft haze of light, through which the lamps blazed out like a pair of fiery meteors. I jumped forward, waved my hat, and I shouted. The mail came down at full speed and passed me. For a moment, I feared that I had not been seen or heard, but it was only for a moment. The coachman pulled up. The guard, muffled to eyes in capes and comforters, and apparently sound asleep in the rumble, neither answered my hail nor made the slightest effort to dismount. The outside passenger did not even turn his head. I opened the door for myself, and I looked in. There were but 3 travelers inside, so I stepped in, shut the door, slipped into the vacant corner, and congratulated myself on my good fortune. The atmosphere of the coach seemed, if possible, colder than the outside air, and was pervaded by a singular, damp, disagreeable smell. I looked around at my fellow passengers. They were all there, men, and all silent. They did not seem to be asleep, but each leaned back in his corner of the vehicle, as if absorbed in his own reflections. I attempted to open a conversation. "Oh, how intensely cold it is tonight," I said, addressing my opposite neighbor. He lifted his head, he looked at me, but made no reply. "The winter," I added, "seems to have begun in earnest." Although the corner in which he sat was so dim that I could distinguish none of his features clearly, I saw that his eyes were still turned full upon me, and yet he answered never a word. At any other time I should have felt and perhaps expressed some annoyance, but at the moment I felt too ill to do either. The icy coldness of the night air had struck a chill to my very marrow, and the strange smell inside the coach was affecting me with an intolerable nausea. I shivered from head to foot, and, turning to my left-hand neighbor, asked if he had any objection to an open window. He neither spoke nor stirred. I repeated the question somewhat more loudly, but with the same result. And then I lost patience and I let the sash down. As I did so, the leather strap broke in my hand, and I observed that the glass was covered with a thick coat of mildew, the accumulation, apparently, of years. My attention being thus drawn to the condition of the coach, I examined it more narrowly, and saw by the uncertain light of the outer lamps that it was in the last stage of dilapidation. Every part of it was not only out of repair, but in a condition of decay. The sashes splintered at the touch. The leather fittings were crusted over with mold and rotting from the woodwork. The floor was almost breaking away beneath my feet. The whole machine, in short, was foul with damp and had evidently been dragged from some outhouse in which it had been rotting away for years. I turned to the third passenger, whom I had not yet addressed, and risked one more remark. "This coach," I said, "is in deplorable condition. The regular coach, I suppose, is under repair." He moved his head slowly and looked me in the face without speaking a word. I shall never forget that look while I live. I turned cold at heart under it. I turn cold at heart even now when I recall it. His eyes glowed with a fiery, unnatural luster. His face was livid as the face of a corpse. His bloodless lips were drawn back as if in the agony of death and showed the gleaming teeth between. The words that I was about to utter died upon my lips, and a strange horror, a dreadful horror, came upon me. My sight had by this time become used to the gloom of the coach, and I could see with tolerable distinctness. I turned to my opposite neighbor. He, too, was looking at me with the same startling pallor in his face and the same stony glitter in his eyes. I passed my hand across my brow. I turned to the passenger on the seat beside my own and saw, oh heaven, how shall I describe what I saw? I saw that he was no living man, that none of them were living men like myself. A pale, phosphorescent light, the light of putrefaction, played upon their awful faces, upon their hair, dank with the dews of the grave, upon their clothes, earth-stained and dropping to pieces, and upon their hands, which were the hands of the corpses long buried. Only their eyes, their terrible eyes, were living, and those eyes were all turned menacingly upon me. A shriek of terror, a wild, unintelligible cry for help and mercy burst from my lips as I flung myself against the door and tried in vain to open it. In a single instant, brief and vivid as a landscape beheld in the flash of summer lightning, I saw the moon shining down through a rift of stormy cloud. The ghastly signpost rearing its warning finger by the wayside, the broken parapet, the plunging horses, the black gulf below. Then the coach reeled like a ship at sea, and there came a mighty crash and a sense of crushing pain, and then darkness. It seemed as if years had gone by when I awoke one morning from a deep sleep and found my wife watching by my bedside. I will pass over the scene that ensued, but give you in half a dozen words the tale she told me with tears of thanksgiving. I had fallen over a precipice, close against the junction of the old coach road and the new, and had only been saved from certain death by lighting upon the deep snowdrift that had accumulated at the foot of the rock beneath. In this snowdrift I was discovered at daybreak by a couple of shepherds who carried me to the nearest shelter and brought a surgeon to my aid. The surgeon found me in a state of raving delirium, with a broken arm and a compound fracture of the skull. The letters in my pocketbook showed my name and address. My wife was summoned to nurse me, and thanks to youth and a fine constitution, I came out of danger at last. The place of my fall, I need scarcely say, was precisely at which a frightful accident had happened to the North Mail 9 years before. I never told my wife the fearful events which I have just related to you. I told the surgeon who attended me, but he treated me the whole adventure as a mere dream born of the fever of my brain. We discussed the question over and over again until we found that we could discuss it with temper no longer, and then we dropped it. Others may form what conclusions they please. Missing Monsters by Jack Lafountain. Excuse me while I turn out the lights. For our purposes, a candle will suffice. I'm going to tell you a ghost story. Don't be afraid, not yet. There are no indestructible masked terrors or hideous dream stalkers in this story. That's because this story happened long ago. Our world was different back then. In those days, scares didn't just jump out at you like the proverbial cat in the trash can for a cheap fright. Monsters alert. They hid themselves in the shadows. They stole up behind you in the pale light of the moon and, well, that's another story. In the far distant year of 1962, Halloween was still untouched by the regulations of local town councils and the social squeamishness advocated by television. It was still a celebration of ancient lore and the love of being scared. They didn't let school out for it, but reading, writing, and arithmetic were suspended. Costumes, candy, and parties were the rule of the day. Dreams of trick-or-treat filled our heads the moment the calendar turned October. The overflowing shelves at the local 5 and dime store added fuel to the fires of youthful imaginations, with row upon row of masks and colorful costumes. For weeks, the perfect scary disguise was hotly debated with classmates till a decision was reached. Then began negotiations with parents and the nearly insurmountable challenge of persuading mothers throughout the land that they could not make the costume just as good as the one at the store. Back then, kids could concentrate on enjoying the night of the candy harvest. Christmas was still months away and far from young minds. There would not be a single hint of garland or the faintest whisper of a carol in stores until the Thanksgiving turkey was reduced to leftovers. Halloween reigned supreme. The land was ripe with candy awaiting the willing laborers in the neighborhood fields. Anticipation built for 30 days and nights, eased only by the arrival of darkness on the 31st evening. My home in Torrance, California lacked the real chill of autumn portrayed in the pictures decorating the classroom and merchandising displays. The leaves on the maple trees that lined our street lacked the bright colors colder times produced. Leaves went from green to muted rusty brown. We didn't mind the absence of fire on the branches. Their bare skeletons morphed into long, bony arms capable of snatching up careless children. And huge jack-o'-lanterns carved with sinister smiles shared porches up and down our street with ghosts fashioned from bed sheets. I was 8 years old that year. My cousins were 9 and 10, and that was our year. It was that monumental Halloween in which we were to go trick-or-treating on our own for the first time. The three of us were to shed the little kid's mantle at last and be loose to stalk the streets as terrifying monsters without our parents. Neighbors, trembling at the thought, were preparing sugary sacrifices to ward off our tricks. Finally, the day arrived, and the eternal month-long countdown ended. It was Halloween. I remember it was the first time a school party ever dragged on too long. Freed by the final bell, I dashed out the door in a mad charge for home, only to be hit with utter disappointment that the wait was not yet over. Despite the fervent, silent prayers offered to whatever God might be listening, the sun refused to hurry its walk to the western horizon. My parents were caught up in some dream scene moving in slow motion, oblivious to the waiting treasure of treats. The 3-mile drive to my uncle's house stretched out for hours. At last, we all piled out of my father's '58 Mercury wagon into the electrically charged dusk. Even the grown-ups seemed excited. At that magical moment, our Halloween metamorphosis began. My eldest cousin became the mummy, his wavy brown hair wrapped in mottled bandages that wound all the way down to the cuffs of his jeans. Just like in the movie, one arm remained curled to his chest. The heavy line of stitches ran across his brother's green-tinged skin, and his black lips seldom smiled. I think it was because of the 2 bolts in his neck through which Dr. Frankenstein had sent 1 billion gigawatts of electricity. The shock may have been too much. He only seemed to growl and walk on stiffened legs. Boris Karloff himself would be frightened at the sight. Still, they paled in comparison to their young companion. My black hair was slicked back to form a V in the middle of my forehead. A black cape hung from my shoulders, and the royal crest of Dracul lay upon my chest. My eyes were ablaze with the power to compel the unwary to fill our sacks with candy. As darkness fell, the waxing crescent moon stepped out of the fading light. Armed with empty pillowcases yearning to be filled with candy, the monstrous trio descended on the city. No house was safe. Neighbors, frightened for their lives, showered us with treats in the hopes of being spared. Young children fled in terror. The three of us renewed our vow to pillage the town of its entire candy supply. We would haunt until the witching hour struck. All the candy must be ours. We circled block after block, spreading fear as our sacks grew full. Only when the overflowing pillowcases turned our arms to lead and our feet to stone did we recognize the shrewdly laid trap sprung on us by the villagers. They thought to laden us with burdens that sapped our powers. We fought back, stuffing candy into our mouths to lighten the load. Our lust for sugar, too soon sated, renewed our powers for the moment. Bellies full, our eyelids began to take on the weight of so many calories and began to sag. "Come on now," the mummy said. Frankenstein's monster agreed. "We must hurry. The sun is almost up," Dracula added. At 8:45 that All Hallows Eve, the mummy, the monster, and the undead count climbed the steps of Dun Castle. Safe in their lair once more, the monsters slept. The neighborhood was safe again, if only for another year. This story is true. We were innocent, so I didn't include our names or bother to change them. The eldest of our trio is gone now. I haven't seen the monster for many years. Still, they haunt my memories of that Halloween when, without reflective tape, flashlights, fire-retardant costumes, candy inspectors, or parental supervision, we roamed the darkness of the streets of the South Bay, accepting candy from strangers, and had the time of our young lives. Where is the ghost in this story, you ask? I did say this was a ghost story, didn't I? The ghost in my story is the ghost of Halloween past. We grew up and our world changed into a place in which a darker fear has sucked the life out of this grand celebration of childhood. All the ghosts, ghouls, and goblins that cavorted with us that night now shrink in mortal terror at the thought of their grandchildren walking unescorted through the night. It's true, the world is different now. And it is also true that we have not made it that way. We have consented to its demise and the death of the old Halloween that we loved. That is the truly scary part of my story. Today, Halloween is a ghost. Its lingering image but a bump in the road to early Christmas sales, and its spirit melted into the dawn of our new age of life before a screen and electronic gadgetry. Missing monsters, gentle haunters, I miss you. Thank you for joining me on this podcast. It was a lot of fun to put together, and I really wanted parents and children alike to enjoy this podcast, and I hope you did. Hope you had a great Halloween. I hope you got a pillowcase full of candy if you even got to go trick or treat. And I hope you get sick on the candy you got so much. And I mean that in a real good and funny way, because that's exactly the way it used to be for us. We'd go get just sacks full of candy and eat it all night and be sick later that night. And you wouldn't want candy for a whole week, and then you'd have to hide it from your mom and dad. But those are, like the last story, Missing Monsters, that's just some of my nostalgic memories of Halloween. They were so much fun. All right, hope you guys have a good week. We'll be back early next week with some Bigfoot stories. We'll see you on the next one. Thank you.